Welcome to another episode of Nebraska Farmcast from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Agricultural Profitability. I'm Ryan Evans, and I'm joined by Nebraska Extension ag economist Jessica Groskopf today to discuss what happens to farmland lease agreements when a landlord passes away. With handshake agreements still somewhat common in Nebraska, the nuances of ownership transitions can create uncertainty for both landlords and tenants. Groskopf has authored a new article up on our center's website at cap.unl.edu that unpacks some scenarios and helps provide clarity on managing farmland leases effectively. Jessica, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So, in a verbal lease, when terms are not written down and signed on, obviously the risk can be that in the event of issues arising, it can become an issue of one party's word against the other party's word. So, what challenges can this present in situations like the death of a landlord?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we are negotiating with the other party, our landlord or our tenant, we're really imagining scenarios in which both parties are alive. But the challenge with a verbal lease or a handshake lease is the fact that there's a probability that either one of those parties could pass. And so this creates so much uncertainty, particularly in the situation where that landlord passes away, right? So that leaves the tenant in this place where they're not sure necessarily who is going to be the next person in charge of that lease. That's one really big uncertainty. But for that landlord's family, what was that agreement actually? And that can be really, really difficult because it puts them in a vulnerable position of asking the tenant, hey, what was our lease agreement that you had with whoever the landowner originally was?
And in your article, you explained three scenarios for land ownership transitions. The first is through a will, then through a trust, or an LLC. So wondering if you could just walk through the key differences between those scenarios and then how each might affect the lease agreement.
Sure. So the first scenario is through a will. So if the landlord passes away and that land passes through the will, that land has to go through what we call the probate process. And probate is the process of retitling assets. And that process can actually take quite a bit of time. So the person who is the personal representative is what we call them in Nebraska. You might hear them called an executor in other states. They are responsible for helping assets get retitled through that court process. So in that kind of transition period, you as the tenant will be dealing with that personal representative because they are in charge of basically managing the person who's died, their assets. Then once probate is complete, then you'll have the new owners of that property who are responsible for it. But that can be kind of that unknown of will the land pass through the will and probate, and how long will that process take? That can be months or even years. When it comes to a trust, if the land is held within the trust and it has to be titled to that trust, the trustee of that trust will be responsible for managing the lease. So depending on the terms of the trust, that land might be simply transferred to the new beneficiaries or owners, or it may be held in the trust and managed by the trust moving forward. So in the situation of a trust, we've got to go back to the trustee and say, okay, how do we move ahead? In the case of an LLC or a corporation, the management of the lease will reside with the officers or owners of that LLC or that corporation. So again, going back to that group of people and saying, this is where we're headed. So when it comes to a trust and an LLC, there's probably a lot more certainty about what's going to happen because you will immediately at the death of that landowner have someone that you can connect with and work with.
Yeah, and then to maybe add further complications to a situation, you also write about crop share leases. So what are some complications that might arise in such an agreement where a crop share is in effect?
So crop share leases continue to complicate the situation because in a crop share lease, we're not just negotiating what is the rental rate, we're also negotiating what is the share, what expenses are shared, and who's responsible for what. There's also a lot more involvement in the decision-making process in a crop share lease agreement from the landlord's perspective. So there's a lot of complexity with a crop share and can be pretty risky if it's done verbally and that landowner passes away.
Yeah, and you often stress the importance of having a written lease agreement for these reasons we've been talking about here today. It just provides that clarity and helps avoid more uncertainty in an already uncertain situation. So for landlords and tenants who are considering making that switch to a written lease from a verbal one, are there essential elements that they should include in that written lease, especially to address unforeseen events like a death?
Yeah. So again, we really encourage you to go to an attorney and have them write out your lease or review a written lease that you have available. Particularly, I think the biggest question when someone passes away, especially if it's the landowner, will I, as the tenant, continue to have access to that property? And so that's something that needs to be addressed. So if you have a crop planted in the ground, traditionally you'll have access to remove that crop. But after that crop year is done, can you continue to farm that property? And that's a big question that needs to be answered within the written lease agreement. And what we're looking for in that scenario is what we call binding on heirs. So is that lease that's written binding on those heirs? And then what are the grounds for termination from that lease?
Right. So as you pointed out, very important to involve an attorney in that process. So that's Jessica Groskopf, an extension educator and agricultural economist with the Center for Agricultural Profitability here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Jessica is based in Scottsbluff, and you can find her new article on this topic of what might happen when a landowner dies in the situation of a verbal lease on our website at cap.unl.edu. It's also linked to in the podcast description wherever you're listening to this. So Jessica, thanks a lot for the great info again.
Thanks, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.